Has it? Oh, yeah, that's not good.
Survival rate seems going down.
By the way, now I
All right, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the last day of Infrastructure Week. I know everybody's been to multiple infrastructure events this week, as I have. Anyway, so we're really pleased to have a panel discussion today about I think a topic that frankly doesn't get all that much attention when it comes to infrastructure. We still have a view of infrastructure as concrete and steel, and in fact, infrastructure is beginning to transform into digital infrastructure, and that's really what we're going to talk about today. I'm Rob Atkinson, I lead ITIF. We just issued a report, Policymakers Guide to Digital Infrastructure on Monday. Actually, the copies back there, I encourage you to look at. And then I'll quickly introduce the panelists. I'll make a few opening remarks about the report and what we found, and then we'll hear comments from everybody. We're going to have plenty of time for questions, and we'll adjourn at 10:30. Let me start with Dan Correa. Dan used to work at ITIF. Regina, oh, sorry, Dan. Dan is actually has gone on to bigger and better things. He's a senior advisor for innovation policy in the White House Office of Science and Technology. And in particular, relevant to this panel today, he leads the White House Smart Cities Initiative, which if you saw the recent innovation strategy for the administration, Dan's fingerprints were all over that, in particular, a lot of the things on smart cities. Regina Hopper is the CEO and president of ITIS America. For those who are not familiar, ITIS America has been around a long time, but really kind of the major organization in the country dealing with intelligent transportation policy questions. Prior to coming to ITIS America, she was the CEO of America's Natural Gas Alliance. Dick Mudge. Dick is a long time expert in transportation policy. I've known Dick for a long time. He's president and founder of Compass Transportation and Technology, Inc. And he's had a background of former president of Apogee Research, and was at the Director of Transportation Policy for the CBO, and also did Transport and RAND Corporation. And finally, Dan Carroll. Dan has also been involved in transportation policy for a long time. He's now a senior advisor at the Beek Center for Social Impact and Innovation at Georgetown. And prior to that, he's got a lot of different positions in administrations and all, but he was most relevant to this was director of a governor's office of multi-state initiatives, where he focused on, among other areas, infrastructure policy. Okay. So, I think one of the reasons why digital infrastructure doesn't get the attention it deserves is, can you tell which one of those is the smart bridge? Well, you can, because we just told you what it was. But if we didn't tell you what it was, you wouldn't know. And the point is that digital infrastructure, with the exception of broadband networks, is just like regular infrastructure. It looks the same, but it acts differently. And that's really the fundamental difference here. It looks the same, but it acts differently. So think about, there we go. Lots of different kinds of infrastructures. Each one of these, whether it's certainly electricity with the smart grid, bicycles, how can you make bicycle systems digital? Well, Copenhagen is doing that, where the traffic lights actually are connected and linked to whether there are bicycles coming. Something as a bicycle rider for 30 years in Washington, I wish we had in DC. Aviation, next-gen air travel control systems. Certainly roads, which we will hear about as well. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so essentially, digital infrastructure is the embedding of sensors and other kinds of measuring devices, as well as some kind of digital transport system to enable those bits to travel into physical infrastructure. And what are the advantages of that? There's actually, I think, an enormous set of advantages that we tend to overlook. So one of these is harnessing market forces. So if you think about that, think about roads, for example. Really not very many market forces with regard to roads. We don't really price roads. Occasionally you'll have a toll road, but by and large we don't have congestion pricing. And if we move to a system of what some people propose, which we've supported, called VMT, Vehicle Miles Traveled Technology, which is essentially digital infrastructure technology, and you had all vehicles on a road pay by the mile. And they would pay by the mile based on things like the weight of the axle weight of the vehicle, the time of day, the type of road. You would increase road efficiency by a significant amount because you would harness market forces. You would send a market signal to the users of those facilities that would say, for example, to a very heavy truck, if you want to drive on this road that really isn't designed for you, you're going to pay a boatload of money because you're going to cause a boatload of damage. It would say to somebody who's driving at maybe 8:30 in the morning on the Beltway to go pick up a cup of coffee, maybe you ought to wait till 9:30 to get that cup of coffee because you're going to pay money to drive on them. We see the same issue with smart meters. So we're in the slow process of making our electric grid intelligent. I mean, I say slow only because compared to many other nations in the world, we are very, very far behind that process. But we can, there's technology to basically make the entire electric grid intelligent, so we know when things are happening, we know when there are outages. One of the things we would know would be when you're operating your electricity in the appliances in the home, you could charge people more money for running your dishwasher at a peak hour. Now, why would you want to do that? Because it costs a lot more money to produce electricity at peak times than it does at non-peak times. Just as we all remember, or some of us remember long distance phone calls, and you would wait until 11 o'clock at night. Why was that? Well, because you have a network and it got congested in the middle of the day and nobody was making calls at night, so they gave you a discount to call at night. That's what this would be. So you bring market forces to the electric system, and you would end up with significant savings. You would enhance efficiency. So, for example, road capacity, as we get to much more intelligent roads and much more intelligent vehicles, we'll see road capacity on highways dramatically improve. This ultimately will be a key factor in solving congestion when cars can travel much more closely together. Next-gen air travel will significantly improve airline efficiency because right now, if you're going from here to San Francisco, you don't go as the crow flies, you go like this because you have to follow the radar path. Next-gen, you go as the crow fly, you save a lot of money. Smarter infrastructure services. I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges with infrastructure, and we see this in our daily lives, is infrastructure providers, they look at their job as building infrastructure. Once it's built, it's kind of forgotten. And essentially what you can do with smarter infrastructure is that you can get real-time data on operations. So for example, Palo Alto, California has a system of hundreds of sensors around the city to monitor parking spot availability. They know when parking spots are available, when they're not. It helps consumers to do that as well. Similarly, we see that in water. One of the biggest problems that cities have with water is leakage. So they'll have water mains that leak. They don't know about it. It costs them millions and millions of dollars. If they were to all install smart water mains, you could really have a big reduction. And so, for example, South Bend, Indiana, on the wastewater side, was discharging 2 billion gallons of sewage into the St. Joseph River every year. But after the city implemented an analytics system that monitors the water levels and automatic control valves, it was able to realize that it had this big problem and was able to fix it. Lastly, providing real-time insight. One of the problems is, again, we have this infrastructure, but we don't really know what's going on with it. So, do we really know where? I mean, we're getting better on roads because of cell phone sensors and the like, but we still don't really know what's going on with infrastructure all the time. Now with sensors, you'll have real-time analytics, real-time insights into things like bridge conditions. That bridge that collapsed in Minneapolis a number of years ago, if that had had real-time sensors on it, they would have known that there were structural problems in that bridge, but they didn't because they were relying on manual inspection. So for example, the Jindo Bridge in South Korea has noted as one of the smartest, if not the smartest bridge in the world. They have installed these sensors, and basically one of the things it's going to do is it's going to reduce the need for costly and unreliable manual inspections. It's interesting, I was talking to somebody the other day about the sensors that are in aircraft engines today. Actually, it was a guy from GE. Aircraft engines are interesting because before they put sensors in aircraft jet engines, they would say, okay, well, you got to repair these engines, or do whatever you do with them, maintain them, every, I don't know, let's say 1,000 hours. I have no idea what it is, X number of hours. Well, what they found was that in some places, like in Saudi Arabia or Qatar, those airlines, they were getting problems, and in other places, they didn't have any problems. Well, it turns out that in Saudi Arabia, the sand is so fine, it gets in the airline, and 10,000 hours is too long, you got to do it at this. And other places, it's fine, the air quality is good, and also. So now they have smart sensors in aircraft engines, and they can do the maintenance when they need the maintenance, not do it too soon or too late. Okay, so what are the overarching issues here? Why aren't we doing more? We compare the United States to other countries, and or certainly some other regions in the world, and frankly, we're not in the lead. We're not anywhere close to the lead. Japan, Korea lead us in terms of ITS on the road. Some of the European cities like Barcelona, Amsterdam lead us in smart cities. A bunch of European countries lead us in smart grid. So what are some of the issues? One issue is really, as we think about that, is security. As we go forward, we have to build security into these systems. And I'm not saying anything new, nor am I saying anything that anybody who's building a system isn't aware of. I think that a lot of the people who claim that there are going to be major security vulnerabilities really don't focus enough on actually what people and companies are doing in this space. Privacy. I think this is kind of one of the biggest barriers in the United States. For example, there has been a huge backlash against smart meters. There's a group called Stop Smart Meters Now, I think, which we labeled, we gave them an award 2 years ago when we did our annual Luddite of the Year award. And they were actually really pleased to get it. They retweeted it. It was really good. Although I did ask the guy why he had a computer, because the computer gives off electromagnetic radiation that he might die from. But he told me he had a big aluminum foil thing in front of his computer. But besides the radiation that they claim for smart meters, which is like a 1/100th of a thousandth of a cell phone, they also fear and claim that the smart grid will steal your privacy. Because, my God, the utility will know that you used electricity at 8 o'clock at night. And the reality is, first of all, utilities are bound by rules. They can't manipulate that data, and they don't manipulate that data. And secondly, who cares? BMT is an area that I have personally had a lot of experience in because I co-chaired a congressional infrastructure finance commission a number of years ago, and a very interesting group, a bipartisan group, super bipartisan, right and left, and the main consensus of our commission to solve this problem was to move to a vehicle miles travel system. Why haven't we done that? We haven't done it because privacy advocates have demagogued this issue and made it sound as if you will be tracked by a VMT system. Which is basically either they're completely ignorant or they're intentionally manipulating thing. Because in a VMT system, the car, no one knows where you are, but you know where you are. In other words, a VMT system works with a one-way GPS signal. It doesn't work with a two-way GPS signal. So there's a GPS signal that tells the vehicle onboard unit, I am right here. It doesn't say anything, it doesn't tell the White House, it doesn't tell Dan where you are. It just says, I am here. So a VMT system is actually more private than a toll road system because your toll transponder tells the toll road company you just went through this toll. VMT system is actually one of the much better on privacy, and yet you hear US senators on the Transportation Committee talk about VMT as a tracking system. And it is the farthest thing from that in the world. And it's partly a response, I think a reflection of privacy people who demagogue this issue, but it's also partly a response to people in the field. I was at the TRB meeting 2 years ago, and I was on a panel and with 3 or 4 folks talking about VMT, and they were talking about VMT tracking. Really, it is not tracking. Stop using the word tracking. So I think the field itself has to come to grips better with that. The third area is really public versus private ownership. One of the things that pricing does is it allows for more private ownership. Why don't we have more private ownership? Because private ownership requires the ability to collect fees, collect money somehow. And with the roads, for example, historically, it was hard to do privatization because it was just hard to do tolling. We've done a little bit of that. But I think VMTs, I think that IT and digitization can allow more private provision of infrastructure. Some people like that, some people don't. I actually like it. I think it's probably a good thing and get more efficiency. So lastly, why don't we have more progress? I think there's a bunch of reasons here. One is this is risky. This is new. People know if you're going to put a certain amount of money into certain building a bridge or something like that, it generally works okay. But this is risky. You don't know how to do it. You don't know what's going to happen. Lack of digital technology experience. You look at most of the infrastructure providers, whether they're municipal waste providers or state DOTs, they don't really have deep digital experience. One of the reasons, by the way, the Japanese lead in this space, they don't have states. So it's like one of the key things that they don't. They have to rely on 50 states kind of with some varying levels of competencies. So they have a national system, and in that national DOT, they have a whole division of electrical engineers and software people, and they're just deeply have expertise in that area. Third area is patient upfront capital. That's a challenge for all infrastructure, but for a lot of these infrastructures, how do you get the money to invest in these even though they're going to have payoff? Coordination challenges. You think that a lot of these systems like the smart grid or VMT, you really want to have a national system. You don't want to have balkanized standards. You also have problems where, for example, if we all had the smart grid, then it would be likely that Whirlpool and GE, I guess GE's not in the appliance business, whoever makes appliances nowadays would give you smart appliances, but they don't give you smart appliances because you don't have a smart grid. So you have this kind of chicken or egg challenge. I mentioned opposition from privacy advocates. And then fragmentation of governments and regulatory bodies. We have 50 different PUCs that have different standards and rules with regard to smart electric grid. We have all these different state DOTs that are fragmented. And lastly on here is really, not on here, but is this question of money. So if you look at, for example, the Reauthorization Act for surface transportation, It was better than it has been in the past for providing money for this. But, we're spending, millions and millions of dollars on a bridge or a section of road, hundreds of millions of dollars often, when we could be putting it into making traffic lights intelligent. You get a much bigger bang for the buck by making city traffic lights intelligent. And one of the easiest thing you could do to fix mobility in the U.S. urban context is make traffic lights intelligent. And it is an order of magnitude cheaper than building roads. What do? We put money into building roads. Just to be clear, I want to build more roads. I think we need a lot more money in transportation. So my point is not that, but my point is that we need a bigger share going into digital infrastructure systems. So how do we do that? A bunch of things, digital friendly regulatory policies that limit some of the barriers. We think all federal agencies, I know Dan's been working on this, but Interior, DOE, FERC, DOT, they all need to basically have an explicit digital strategy for how they're going to move in this direction. I mentioned funding, and then finally, we shouldn't pay attention to the privacy advocates. Or at least we shouldn't pay attention to their apocalyptic fears. It's not saying we shouldn't build privacy into these systems, but we can and we do build privacy into these systems. We shouldn't let privacy stop us from transforming our infrastructure. So with that, I'll stop and look forward to the panel's comments. Dan?
Great. Thanks so much, Rob. And it's great to be here. So, as Rob mentioned, I was here 10 years ago.
You're my first time.
I know. So, first of all, congrats on making it to 10 years of relentless advocacy and provocation. For the ITIF staff in the room, I think if you think Rob is hard to handle now, imagine being the only one. Just think about that. And that was my distinct, his entire focus. Because I was the first employee when he kicked it off back in 2006. So, but anyway, it's been fun and interesting to follow along and see this team lead on a lot of really important issues related to innovation and technology. So, I thought I might say a little bit from the administration perspective about unpack a little bit of the challenges that we're seeing in this area of digital infrastructure, with a particular focus on cities, because as Rob mentioned, I lead this White House Smart Cities Initiative. Because I think it's instructive, because the way that we think about these issues is that starting from doing a lot of digging on around the challenges is what inform how we have developed the policies and the portfolio of investments that we've included in some of these plans. So let me just give a quick list of these that I think are particularly important in preventing progress. And I think Rob mentioned several of them, and I think there's a few additions that I would highlight. So the first one is just, I think this movement of injecting digital tools into infrastructure is, in some cases, I think there's still a need for a killer app. Like, what's the really compelling case study with proven return on investment that you can bring to a local leader, whether we're talking about, I think, water infrastructure or transportation elsewhere, where you can say, look, this is an overwhelmingly compelling case for how you should be spending your money. And I think it's getting there, but at least what we're hearing at the local level, that there's a tremendous need to still see this. I think we all know that local investments and local leadership, they think about the imperative of being the first one to be second, right? So I think there's a massive need for that. And I think also we come at this conversation about thinking about all of the opportunities and value in using new technologies. Those that are thinking about just infrastructure, not technology and infrastructure, are having often different conversations. And there's always the question raised of, is it a tech tool that's looking for a use, or do we have a compelling use and need, and then we find a tech tool that works? So I think making that case really effectively, I think there's still a need to do that. And so that's certainly a challenge at the local level. And I think one of the challenges there is there's just a need for test beds that allow multi-sector collaborations to come together to prove out how these things work and why they can be effective and have an impact with a real return on investment that is replicable. So that's the second one. I think the next two are related. The first is, I think there's a tremendous need for long-term thinking and strategic planning in the area of how we incorporate technology, digital technologies into these infrastructures. It's natural for communities to think about how you build the next road that has one more lane, but it's less natural probably to think about how we incorporate connected and autonomous vehicles and what are the things that we'll need to build out to do that really effectively, especially when the question is so dynamic. We think differently about this than we did only a few years ago. And so I think that's the fourth challenge, that is leadership and talent, technical talent and technical savvy. So if we're talking about building out smart, just an example, smart streetlights that have not only LED, but when the LED lights are installed at significant savings, the public utility also decides to put in, or the city, also decides to put in some sort of additional sensors like gunshot detectors. That is a benefit that accrues to the police department, whereas the utility or the Department of Public Works is the one that made the investment. So there's a huge need for leadership that will span oftentimes not only city departments, but often entirely different governing bodies, right? And I think the same could be said in the transportation space at a regional level. So I think that takes significant leadership, and in order to understand what the opportunities are and how to do that really well, there need to be teams of individuals who have some technical savvy and understand the value here and how to do this right and how to make the interoperability work and how to get the right cybersecurity solutions in place. So I think that's an important one as well. The last two I'll mention, Rob mentioned, I think there's a lack of investment. Hopefully that's something that's getting better, but certainly we're talking about some things that require significant investment, and it's a challenge. And it's not just money, but I think it's also financing. How do you do performance contracting for new technologies that are not yet proven? Where do you find the investment, and what are the set of arrangements that you need, and how do you run procurement to do it really well? I think that's a challenge. And the last one is just broadly, I think there are questions around policy issues related to privacy, related to data, and related to a bunch of the issues that Rob mentioned. So there's a huge question around how to do this well, and there's regulatory questions, and that's something to think about as well. So with those challenges posed, I just want to say a few words about some of the things that we're doing at the federal level that the administration is excited about, that I think are at least some initial steps to trying to tackle some of those challenges, because I do agree with the outlook that Rob just articulated, which is that we are at a time of great opportunity here for significant savings and significant efficiencies to be introduced into our infrastructure. So we mentioned the White House Smart Cities Initiative. We launched that last fall with an initial investment of $160 million. The focus is not solely on infrastructure, it's about cities and communities facing pressing challenges and how providing them the tools to use IT more effectively, whether it's sensor networks, data analytics, and cloud computing, to solve those challenges, to tackle those challenges. So it's not just a focus on building out the infrastructure, but also building out the use cases and using it really effectively. So that initiative includes investments in primarily focused on what we call research, development, and deployment. So making sure that we continue to grow the pipeline of Internet of Things technologies that can be applied in cities and communities. There's a huge emphasis on that, as well as test bedding some of the technologies that already exist to try to align the right multi-sector collaborations. So the question we ask is, how can the federal government put resources on the table to bring together the local regional authorities, cities, utilities, et cetera, along with companies, nonprofits, universities, and other stakeholders to actually drive progress and test bed new approaches. So I think one example of how this works is that the National Science Foundation, as part of this initiative, they're funding the Array of Things in Chicago, which is actually now scaling to many different cities around the country. But NSF has provided $3 million for the University of Chicago to deploy a sensor network of 500 nodes around Chicago to monitor the ambient environment and collect a bunch of data. And I think what's interesting about this is that they're scoping and answering a bunch of research questions about what value is there. University is closely involved because it's something where they have a ton of academic questions about how that'll inform city governments for urban informatics. And I think the reason I highlight it is because I think it's an interesting, it has raised interesting and novel questions around privacy. They're collecting data all over the city. And if you read in the newspapers, this is controversial. So they want to do this in Chicago, and they're starting to do it in other cities around the country. And I think this is one way in which we testbed collectively and try to answer some of those questions about what the right path forward is. What are the rules that should govern the data that's collected? So I think you have to go out and do it in order to actually try to get some answers to those questions. And I think and that's part of this initiative. So the example that Rob mentioned about combined sewer overflow in South Bend, that's one of the core examples, I think, that inspires some of the work that's part of our initiative, which is a new outside partnership between cities and universities. So actually, the part that Rob didn't mention about the Notre Dame, about the South Bend example, is that the technology that was developed and deployed in South Bend was actually developed at Notre Dame. Their research into the development of the smart valves that allowed the city to deploy the smart technology that more efficiently managed water and allocated water in times of significant rainstorms. It was developed at the university, and it only happened because there was a close collaboration between the city and the university. So, our initiative recognizes that these types of collaborations are starting to happen all over the country. So part of the initiative, and in answer to the president's call around this topic, was the creation of the new Metro Lab Network, which is an independent outside organization that links up cities and universities to do projects just like that. So I think there's a core role for universities to be involved. We're seeing, at this point, I think there's over 30 cities signed up to this network, over 44 universities. And I think that's a core node for how a lot of these new test beds are going to happen. And I think there's a really important role for industry to get involved and to participate in those collaborations and help to bring them to market as new technologies are under development. Let me just say a little bit about the DOT effort, which I'm sure we're going to talk more about. That's another, the DOT Smart City Challenge is something that we're very excited about. And I want to leave you and close with that, because I think this is an interesting model, an interesting new model for collaboration, interesting new model for how the federal government can fund innovation in areas like this. So for those who haven't been following, the Department of Transportation has, through the Smart City Challenge, is making available $40 million for a single city to fund the development of an exemplar next generation transportation ecosystem within that community. This has been happening very rapidly. They're currently in the final stages. There are 7 finalist cities. And they received a ton of interest from cities. I think it was 78 cities applied. And now the 7 finalists, they've each received $100,000 of a down payment to develop their final plans. And it's something that cities are really digging into, and they're digging into in an incredibly collaborative way. And the reason for that is the following. First, the money that DOT put on the table was significant, right? $40 million. You're not going to be able to totally, in infrastructure, that's not a ton. But in terms of innovation, I think that's a lot. Second, it's the money asks cities to develop their own vision, to identify their partners in industry, in universities, nonprofit entrepreneurs, et cetera. The cities have been asked to figure out what problems they want to solve, that they feel like are the pressing challenges, and what they want to see happen. So, cities are coming forward and saying, I think we need to create autonomous vehicle corridors. We want to do vehicle to infrastructure communication. We want to do it in this area. These are the kind of problems we want to solve. So the idea is to create these test beds or create a test bed in one community. And there's a lot of industry money on the table as well that the $40 million also leveraging. Create a test bed that creates something that's totally replicable and is going to help drive progress over the next generation on this topic. And one observation that I heard, I was actually talking to one of the finalists, representatives from one of the finalist cities, and they said to me that last week, they said, we have made more progress in doing strategic planning and scoping the future of what our transportation infrastructure looks like in the last 3 months during the process of applying for this than we did in the last 3 years. So they're forging all these new conversations and making all of this progress that we're hopeful that it won't just be one community. There'll be many more that actually take the steps to implement this. So I think that's an interesting model. I think we like it a lot. It'd be interesting to see, to think about how that kind of model could be replicated in other areas. The last thing I'd say is I think the President's Council Advisors on Science and Technology recently released a report on technology in the future of cities. This is an outside organization, advising body that advises the President on a range of scientific and technology topics. There are a bunch of exciting ideas contained in their report that have a tremendous amount of potential. And I think they build on a lot of the things that I just mentioned and talk about the next steps. And I think that's a worthwhile part of this conversation. So I've probably gone long enough. So let me yield the floor.
Thanks, Dan. That was great, and it'll be really interesting to see over the course of the next maybe year or so how these projects turn out, and we'll start to see things on the ground. It's very exciting. So, Regina.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, ITIF. For us, ITS America, this is enormously important, and we cannot thank you all enough for bringing awareness to the issues, sort of in this nice little package, right? To be able to say, here's what ITS is, here's what intelligent infrastructure means, here's what it can do for the economy, for safety, for sustainability. And so thank you so much, because this is a great gift to us as we, as ITS America, try to move forward and bring what you said, Dan, is really the recognition of what ITS can do. If you go on our website, you will see that we have now started a social media campaign called #ThisIsITS. And the reason that we did that is exactly the reason what you bring up, Dan, which is that people need to see ITS at work. And they need to understand what that means for them on a day-to-day basis. We have the distinct honor of representing so many different parts of the schematic across intelligent transportation. We have the public sector through all of our state DOTs and their executive directors who on a day-to-day basis have to make the decision, do I utilize money to fill the pothole to work on the bridge, or do I utilize money to move forward intelligent transportation and technological advances to where I can increase safety and take advantage of the fact that I'm not going to be able to build out any more roads. You see the state DOT director in Pennsylvania who just recently said she wasn't necessarily thought of as being a great leader necessarily of the state in putting forward infrastructure from an intelligent perspective, but in fact they are. It's just very, very difficult to see it because you can't cut the ribbon on the bridge when you put sensors in the road. And you can't really hang a medal on data that's moving across the spectrum to say, oh, this is how it's been helpful to us. So ITS America is trying very hard to bring, Dan, as you say, the recognition to a day-to-day, to people day-to-day, to say this is what ITS is. We have the head of the CTO for the city of New York City, who sits on our board, and he just recently, they worked on a project where they are moving people in the lower part of Manhattan by bus, and they're trying to figure out how can we more rapidly and safely move those people across the lower part of Manhattan during rush hours, morning and afternoon. And they were able to utilize intelligent transportation technologies to basically have when you get on the bus at point A, if you're going to point E, you don't stop. It's not the local, it's the express. But that it's intelligent transportation that's allowing them to do that, the technology. But how do they then communicate that out to folks? So what we're saying is, well, you say to the woman or the man on the bus, it used to take you 25 minutes and now it takes you 10. That allows you to spend more time with your kids, allows you to fix dinner at night, allows you to coach your baseball or basketball team for your children, allows you to take that extra class at night or in the morning if you want to advance your degree. This is the way that ITS can make a distinct difference in your life. So these are things that we're trying to do. These test beds that Dan talked about are extraordinarily important. And if you go back and look at how what was written into the FAST Act that was passed last December by Congress, you will see that there was a distinct way in which they were putting grants and other infrastructure development forward to where these test beds can actually take place. One of the great things that's happening is the pilots that are happening in 3 cities on connected vehicles. And in cities like Tampa, where you have great congestion, you're able now through these test bed grants and pilots to really look at how ITS technology can make a difference. This, of course, feeds into, as you said, Dan, the strategic planning. For our folks on the public side, as one of our directors said the other day when we were having a meeting with the Ubers and the Lyfts of the world and trying to figure out how this new shared mobility, shared use mobility is supposed to help advance transportation, safety, and sustainability, he said, look, I'm all for wanting to adapt technology, but I don't want to have adapted the Betamax. I don't want to be the guy who chose Betamax. And so this goes to what you were saying, Rob, and what you were saying, Dan, which is making sure that we have in place ways for which those on the local and the state level, those who are responsible for their infrastructure each and every day, to be able to have the assets and the knowledge to say, what does that mean? Not just how much does it cost, but what does it mean and how do I do strategic planning across the years where I can incorporate. The great state of Utah, Carlos Bracaris, who's the head of the state there, DOT, he has already started thinking about how do I now incorporate new technology when I'm building roads or when I am improving roads. So if I'm going to tear up the road to put new infrastructure down, traditional infrastructure down, how can I go ahead and embed the sensors now? How can I go ahead and put broadband capability in now? And even though we might not light that up right now, we know that in the future we will be able to light that up. And, oh, by the way, I might have a business model. He said, I can lease back that unused broadband ability back to carriers or others and make money for my state. So there are these innovative ideas that are going on around strategic planning. One of the things that we have done is try to incorporate various areas of learning into our ITS programs. And so just in another month, actually, and this comes out, I'm going to come back to you, Rob, and see if maybe you want to help me in another month, because Dick is already helping me out in San Jose, where we're going to be talking about, in the next month, we're going to be talking about what is intelligent transportation, how do we move that forward, and is transportation really at the center of the Internet of Things? And in that, we will be having conversations, what we're calling ITS University, where we're doing that, we're teaching how do technology folks talk to transportation folks, how do transportation folks talk to technology folks. I was out at CES in January and I had a really nice young man who works in the areas of startups and transportation, moves billions of dollars through the communities of startups each and every day. And as we were having a panel there, we kept talking about NHTSA. NHTSA this, NHTSA that, this is what NHTSA does, this is what NHTSA needs to do, this is what 5.9 is, what should we do with the spectrum issue. And he came up afterwards and he goes, you know, this is really interesting to me. He goes, and I do not mind being the dumbest person in the room. What's a NHTSA? And so it dawns on you very quickly that in this ever-changing technological world, we take for granted our lingo and they take for granted their lingo, and the two shall meet somewhere. And so ITS America is trying to bring that together. Issues with regard to aftermarket products. how do you take this and make my 2007 Volkswagen Bug a smart vehicle? Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? What does it mean from a public policy perspective? What does it mean from a business model perspective? And so these are questions. As a matter of fact, when I was driving in today using my Waze app, you have to think to yourself as you put your headphone in, your little Bluetooth in, and it's saying turn right on K, turn left on L, the radio's going, you're trying to dodge the bicyclists and the pedestrians. How is it that we think about this from a consumer utilization perspective? With regard to terrorism, security, privacy issues, these are very important, and we are looking at those as well. So overall, public policy, utilization, private-public partnerships, how we move ITS forward, these are all the things ITS America is trying to do, both from a Washington perspective and from the broader world perspective. So I'll wrap up there.
Great. Thank you, Regina. Nick?
Sure. One thing Rob forgot to mention about my background is that I am a card-carrying economist. And so I will be talking about some economics, and I know what happens in universities now. I've been told that students are about to read a book that may make them nervous or queasy about something they're warned about it. So before I talk about economics, I will give you a warning in case that is something which or if you're just looking for a snooze, they may make your time. We use the word infrastructure a lot. That's a clumsy term, but it means something to certain people. I think the adjectives that go along with it are important. As Rob mentioned, digital, which is very important. My personal favorite is network scale. And networks are important because that's what generates national economic value. And there's a linkage between digital as well as network scale. If you look at network scale investments, there are two characteristics of them. Number one is they generate economic benefits that can actually change the world. These are on a different scale than you get from adding a lane on a highway or something. Secondly, we consistently underestimate the value and always get it wrong. And let me give you a couple of examples. The interstate highway system, if you would apply economic analysis to it, only 1/3 of it was justified on a benefit cost basis. Only one road across the Rockies made sense. But thankfully, there were no PhD economists involved in working on the interstate highway system, because in fact what happened was the interstate generated annual rates of return of 50 to 60% a year over 2 decades. Now this is the type of return that venture capital people like. The interstate highway system generated 1/4 of all the nation's productivity gains over that time period. And that's just from 4 cents a gallon. It created a national market. Interestingly enough, the industries that gained the most from this were not the freight-dependent manufacturing, but the service economy. And another example is of course the internet. The internet was mainly originally designed to help academic institutions talk to each other. And we all know what's happened with it. It created new businesses, new markets, new industries. We all live on the internet. Another example is wireless telecommunications. A good friend of mine was hired by AT&T about 35 or 40 years ago to do a market study for how big wireless telecommunications would be. And he thought maybe there might be 25% market penetration. And AT&T said, "You're crazy. We can't see more than 1 or 2%. That's all it's going to be." They then sold the technology to another firm, and 15 years later, so had to buy it back at a somewhat larger premium. So even you get this stuff wrong very easily. A key thing about network impacts is they generate a non-linear impact. Now this is now I'm going to get into some economics. Economics 101, everybody's talking about supply and demand curves, and you look in where they cross that, you get a price point from that. What nonlinear change means for on this scale is you shift supply and demand. There's new industries created, new markets. We're not looking at the same economic structure as before. And that's one reason it's nonlinear, one reason it's very, very hard, in fact, maybe even impossible to predict accurately what the impact is going to be. And I will say this is, this shift in supply and demand was something I was not taught in graduate school. It's not the standard way you do things because it's hard to analyze. In thinking about the economic effect of it, there are three things that happen. Number one, you have a productivity effect. You get more for less. And Rob just did a report a couple of weeks ago about the economic importance of this stuff, of productivity, and the fact that our economic productivity is lower than it has been in the past. Second, you have a factor demand effect. And that means with improved accessibility, businesses change the mix of labor, they change the mix of intermediate goods, they change the mix of capital that comes out of that they put into their production, and that has several effects. One is your cost drop. Two, your quality goes up. Three, you've generated new products and new services. The third effect is you have an output expansion. From all these things, you have new markets, lower costs, more stuff is being produced, not just in traditional markets, but new markets, new ways of doing things. You get positive synergies. And this is great stuff. Now the issue is, where is this going to happen next? What can we do to help find these things? Now my personal view, when I tell people I have not yet drunk the Kool-Aid, but I can see where the glass is sitting on the table. And that's about autonomous vehicles. And these, in a sense, are self-driving cars. These are a way that you're getting the advantages of transportation and the internet and wireless communication all pulled together. And these are very interesting things. Number one, there's very little public investment involvement. This is almost completely private. You know, recently Congress passed the FAST Act. A lot of money for surface transportation. Nothing in there about autonomous vehicles, and no impact on what the private sector is doing. They're going even faster than before. In thinking about the value of this stuff, it's easy to focus on a lot of what the direct benefits are. And number one, of course, is safety. You know, we all know that the vast majority of accidents are caused by driver failures, like 95% or so. So there's an opportunity to reduce accidents, save lives, and this is all good stuff. It provides access to people who can't drive. Huge social impacts that come out of this. As with the examples I mentioned before, I think the indirect benefits, the indirect things, the productivity gains are the hardest to measure and the hardest to look at. I happen to believe they're much bigger than all the direct gains that come out of it. Now, how does this happen? You look at decreased accidents means you'll have less congestion, traffic will flow better. Accidents account for maybe 30% or more of all traffic congestion. Secondly, as vehicles communicate with each other, you'll be able to reduce headways safely. So you can fit more cars going through a given piece of roadway at the same time and do it safely than before. Now, there's a lot of disagreement about how big an effect that is. Secretary Fox's favorite report, Beyond Traffic, says there'll be a 5-fold increase in roadway capacity. I think someone found a very nice simulation model that shows that. I don't think most people believe it'll be anywhere near that. But any type of increase is important. So, for example, suppose you'll be able to double effective capacity of highways. That's important because if you double the capacity of the highway, you'll have a 4-fold increase in accessibility. Basically pi r squared, so you can double how far you can go in a given length of time. You'll have access to 4 times the labor pool. Individuals will have access to 4 times the potential jobs. This converts back into economic productivity. It's the same thing that the interstate did, the same thing that the internet did. If you can improve that accessibility, you have huge economic gains out of that. There have been studies done that have looked at, on a small scale, if you have a 10% increase in accessibility, you can get a 2 to 2.5% increase in economic productivity. Now, 2 to 2.5% is small, which is multiplied times a huge, huge number. Morgan Stanley did an estimate of the economic value of autonomous vehicles and said it was $1.3 trillion. They ignored all the economic productivity gains that I'm talking about. This stuff has massive, massive potential. As I guess Dan was saying earlier, the problem is we've never had to face this. How do we get it done? Are there different models for what the public sector should be doing? And those are questions that have still not been answered. But when I look at this for the first time in at least 20 years or more, I am optimistic about the future of transportation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dick. Dan?
I'm going to steal Dick's mic because my light's not on. Thanks very much for doing this event. Happy Infrastructure Week. I think you're asking exactly the right question in terms of infrastructure. How do we shift from 20th and sometimes 19th century infrastructure systems to the 21st century? We all, and we talked a little bit today, know what's happening in digitizing out there. You've got new distributed networks in energy and other areas, even a redefinition of baseload power on the horizon, but we're certainly not there yet. And see Nevada and other places, a lot of folks don't necessarily agree on where to go. You've got disrupting business models and churn everywhere, transportation, gas tax, revenues down, BMT pilots in Oregon and a few other places, but clearly we're not there yet. We need to get there. And then we have new essential 21st century infrastructure categories like broadband, where we're not in every home yet, and how do we wire up rural areas becomes a huge economic question. So I think the key I would put out there is looking at what are the transition and acceleration strategies to move towards this digital 21st century infrastructure and overcome, if you will, the valley of death, because getting innovation embedded into systems is a big challenge. So I'm going to put out 3 transitional strategies to think about. If I don't get the hook from Rob, I'll add a couple specific examples on the back end of that about how this is already happening. So first I would say we've got to think bottom up, not top down. 3/4 of infrastructure spend happens at the local and state level. We want federal money. We can't do without federal money. We need great ideas coming through, money coming through, but at the end of the day, grand bargains are not going to save local and state areas, and that's why I think you're already seeing, Dan mentioned his work with the smart cities, innovation at the city level is being tried. At the state and regional level, we're seeing new mechanisms like the West Coast Infrastructure Exchange and the Intermountain Infrastructure Exchange to figure out how to do intermodal and financial innovation and public-private partnerships in a new way. I think the missing link that continues to be getting in the way right now for local innovators is what's called pre-development capital. Generally speaking, 5 to 10% of the total cost of an infrastructure project, depending on the mode, is design, early economic studies, early engineering, pre-development. That money is really, really hard to get. In transportation, you can use gas tax money. In just about every other mode, the private sector expects the public sector to do that and then wring out any project risk. And if you don't have that money for innovative projects, if you're trying to do water and energy nexus or new sensor projects, all those sort of thing, that money is really hard to get, and it's really hard to get at a time when local and state finance has never recovered really from the new normal. So how we can advocate at the federal level for pre-development assistance to drive innovation and digitization is low cost, high impact, and it's something that I think maybe is next year's theme for Infrastructure Week. Second transition strategy is focusing on infrastructure performance. We have a $3 trillion deferred maintenance gap. Why? Generally, we go for the low cost capital bid. We don't look at the lifetime cost of maintaining a 30 to 40 year asset. We don't treat it as an asset or portfolio. We need to fix that because coming back later for the money is expensive. Data innovation to help answer the question, what are we buying with taxpayer money at the front end? Critically important, whether it's broadband speed or VMT or how much dirty water goes out of a sewer line. that data innovation is critical in this shift to what we call performance-based infrastructure. Third, as I said, we need a suite of innovation embed strategies. There were some great ideas in the new report that Rob's folks have put out. Frankly, neat 21st century ideas are not going to get implemented unless they get anchored into core budgeting, permitting, procurement systems, and show the folks that are running the systems that they can get even better outcomes and be heroes. It's hard to get and try new things at the local level. There are, I call them warlords that run certain agencies or procurement systems that don't necessarily want to do things a new way. Trying and taking risk in new ways and ending up being a bad press story. I mean, these are real barriers to innovation that are out there. We do think there are ways to overcome it. I threw at the back table a new working paper we've done at the Beck Center at Georgetown, which, by the way, is a proud member of Metro Lab. Mentioned Dan. Trying to lay out sort of a David Letterman top 10 list of how to do this shift. I'll put out a few right now. Moving from 1 to 2 year budgeting to 10-year capital budgeting. It's a good way to get people excited about what infrastructure needs are in a region. Infrastructure Ontario did an incredible job where they had a $450 million crossover run in the new Toronto Blue Jays stadium and said, time out, we just could have spent $450 million on other things. So this 10-year budgeting thing helps drive the performance shift. Second thing is empowering chief financial officers at the local and state level. So they can decide and look at what government is buying, not just individual agencies that want to do their tech projects. So in many cases, the largest energy user in a region is the wastewater treatment plant, run and driven by different people. So CFOs driving that shift, I think, could do a lot for embedding digitalization and outcomes and measurement. Oregon passed the law that requires an infrastructure cost and value assessment for every time the state credit card is used above $25 million. They do use that in the Canadian provinces now. So that moment of pause to say, what exactly are we buying, creates huge opportunities to assess climate risk, to look at integration opportunities, and to look at ways to save money. So centers of expertise, CFOs, and this infrastructure risk assessment, if you will, I think are key embed strategies that will open up a lot more opportunity for infrastructure innovation. Let me throw out two quick specific examples of how this is working now. In the procurement area, this doesn't have to involve government, this doesn't have to involve a lot of change, doesn't require a new law. Procurement officials are starting to look at new ways to include in the bid smarter measurement and innovation tools. So there's something called AutoCase, autocase.com. I don't mean it could be a commercial, but it's an effort to do triple bottom line analysis, including design at the engineer's desk. San Francisco Airport is doing a new terminal bid, I think Terminal 1 or 2 rehab, where they're requiring in the procurement, please use this tool and include that in your bid. And it creates, I think, a lot of change in how that looks. Wichita wastewater treatment facility has a new procurement that, again, is bringing in a lot of this life cycle performance, innovation, data thinking. On the permitting and regulatory side, a big fan of a group called Freshwater Trust in Oregon that is using, Google Earth and working with ranchers to look at solving the problem. There are many, many wastewater treatment facilities in medium-sized cities across the country, 10, 20, $30 million that were built in the late 60s, 70s in response to the Clean Water Act. They're getting old, and localities can't afford to treat or finance these changes. So the issue is then, how do you restore rivers, plant more trees, create more shade, and get the same outcome downstream as opposed to a single source treatment? And so they're combining technology tools to understand what acreage can be restored most effectively, get the same net results, and all of this is measured. So there's something called the Willamette Partnership, where EPA has approved in Washington State, Oregon, and Idaho this model. So figuring out through procurement and permitting where data can help get the same or better outcomes, I think can be very transformative, because first time over the first time over the wall is very hard. It takes a while to convince permitting warlords or procurement warlords that this isn't hard. Chief financial officers, once they find out that there's no difference in their spreadsheet between a monthly bond payment and a monthly performance payment, which is so critical to getting infrastructure public-private partnerships started. So with that.
Dan, thank you. I think, this point about performance-based infrastructure, I think is really important because it drives digitization in two ways. One is, it's harder to measure performance. It's easier to measure performance if things are digitized. And secondly, when you measure performance, you tend to go towards digital solutions because they're cheaper and they have a bigger bang for the buck. And if you don't really care about performance, you just do the expensive thing that's kind of sometimes wasteful. So I fully agree that moving more towards a performance-based system in everything we do is really going to be a key. So let's open it up for questions for anybody. If you just want to identify yourself and also wait for the microphone to come around. I'm sure somebody has a question. Right here.
Bob Hershey, Energy Consultant. What have been some of the ones that have been done so far that you can point to as successes?
When you say one, like a performance project, or okay. I'm a big fan of the Long Beach Courthouse in California. So it was a design, build, operate, maintain, finance project. On time, on budget. Programmatically, I would point you to British Columbia, Partnerships British Columbia, Infrastructure Ontario, where on time, on budget performance has increased. They've done over $100 billion in projects by using this method. I think the important holdup as we think about applying this method in the US, we need centers of expertise, and then people talk about value for money analyses and business case as a critical step, which it is. But in California, this is an economist, Dick can help me with this, you can make a business case come out any way you want if you change the imputed rate of return over time. So in California, I think there was some controversy in the legislature over the method used for the Long Beach Courthouse. I think even a competing bidder was kind of grumpy and got a legislative study going. So when people talk about we just need a standard business case and then we can break this open in the US, I think that's wrong. I think what we have is we need trusted centers of expertise that are very transparent, that use the same method over and over again. And maybe British Columbia's is different than Ontario's, but the trusted center of expertise that does this business case their way consistently is how we break this open. The notion that there's one perfect way to do it. But Long Beach Courthouse, I think, is a great example. The Miami Port Tunnel has elements of this as well. And not to be a commercial, but our report has some more case studies in it as well.
Let me just, I'm a big fan of performance measures as well. I think if you get involved too much, lots of people say we should apply techniques like benefit cost analysis to everything. And I've rarely seen a benefit cost analysis that failed. So I want to, I think the simpler measures, how much are we getting out of this investment, are easier. More people understand them. In transportation, the biggest bang for your buck you get is with adaptive signal controls. And there's a number of studies showing the value of that.
Which is why we don't do it. How many times have we all sat in signals in Washington? There's one in Bethesda that just drives me crazy because 10 years ago there was a road that was sort of there, but now the road's not there anymore, but the signal is still there. So it really goes to the point of if we had a performance-based system, we'd move more in that direction. Other comments or questions?
So I just wanted to follow up on Dan's comment about the Smart Cities Challenge. I think everyone in this room is very excited about that. 7 great finalists, but there will only be one winner. And Dan made a point about institutionalizing that. And I guess my question would be, what needs to happen from a public policy perspective to institutionalize that? What needs to happen in the next authorization, appropriation cycles, where we can see this repeated? And then the secondary question is, of those other 6 cities that may not win, are there other funding vehicles where they can utilize to at least achieve some of that vision?
Anybody want to Dan?
I think there's a real opportunity, call it what you want, federalism 2.0, that creating some sort of flexible innovation fund where federal standards around pre-development, performance, digitization can be in there. And then depending on what you want to do in your community, moving from you've got to play through these silos, or some of these competitions are great, but they don't fit with what you need, to be able to say, the Tiger Grant's very popular because they were like that. So I think creating some opportunity where you can create a performance partnership with the federal government to achieve a bunch of outcomes you want. We're fine on broadband. We need to focus on doing the MNet system on wastewater. I think something like that would be very popular, and I think the shift to performance is also important because it's all about transferring risk to the private sector if you can, and getting better bang for the buck. And sometimes that leads to private sector investment, but usually it just leads to more efficient infrastructure. So I would say giving more flexibility would be key.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, right? Because you have seen this extraordinary interest in the Smart Cities Challenge. 78 cities, all of whom applied, 7 finalists. You see Vulcan and others now jumping into this saying, we want to put money into this. So it's going to be interesting to watch how that public-private partnership sort of model theory begins to emerge as you, no matter what industry you're in, you can look at this and say, is that a model that can help advance this? The second thing that I would point to is that for the first time in an authorization bill in the FAST Act, we had an innovation title. So the December bill gave us an innovation title. In that innovation title, there were 5 or 6 different tracks, I would say, upon which intelligent transportation initiatives were specifically called out for grants or federal funding, which allows us, if we are very creative, to go in and say, how can we do what Dan talked about and what Dick talked about in looking to see how does the economic benefits actually match the public perception. And I think if we can pull that together in utilizing this creatively, you'll see more of this. One of the things that we've decided to do is while we work with those cities that are moving forward within the Smart Cities Challenge in and of itself, we are also now reaching out to the other 72 cities, because they now have put forward, even if you just stop at the 72, right? They have put forward an interest in saying, how do we learn? If it is in fact true that one city is 3 years ahead of itself in strategic planning, that could be so for some of the 70 others that we just don't know about. So we are actually putting together an initiative of working with those 70 odd cities and working with DOT in an effort to say, oh, well, how do we do this? We had a discussion with the city of Austin, who was one of the finalists. And finalists or no, what they said to us was, we need to learn how to better interact with our private partners, right? We need to understand how we can have that conversation. So going directly to your question, you could have a whole initiative based around communication between the public and the private sector to better do what everyone here said. Get the digitization out, make sure it happens at a federal and state level, make sure it has economic benefits, and make sure there are performance requirements. And all 4 of those things can come together. So we see it as something really extraordinary that this is done.
Great. Yeah, I could just build on that. I totally agree. I think, so to answer just a few pieces of your question, I think there are specific funding mechanisms that are available outside of the Smart City Challenge that are nonetheless relevant and in service of the same goals. One example was something that was included in the FAST Act, $60 million available in amounts of $60 million overall amounts, up to $12 million available to one particular community. And it's for congestion mitigation, and there's a deadline on June 3rd to apply. So any community of the 78 or anybody else can apply. But I think it's those very useful mechanisms that are also available, that resources on the table. And I think the Department of Transportation is doing a good job of making sure that cities and communities are aware that these are out there. Now that they've got their plans in place, I think there's a concerted effort to make sure that everyone knows that there's other resources available as well. The second thing I'd mention is that I believe that DOT is planning on actually making the applications of all 78 cities available online. So there are themes throughout all of these applications. A lot of these cities, believe it or not, are thinking about a lot of the same topics, struggling with the same challenges, and thinking about the same opportunities for innovation. I think that's going to be a rich data set for exploring where there are opportunities of shared interest, where outside organizations, certainly DOT is providing technical assistance and wants to continue to provide that, but they're resource constrained. So I think there's going to be a huge opportunity for outside organizations, whether they are industry groups like ITS or I think nonprofits or even national new cities type organizations. I think there's a huge opportunity to bridge some of these barriers to new knowledge.
Let me just add one thing. I think that one of the sort of pitfalls I think that Congress and administrative agencies get in is they've sort of been doing this for so long that they look at their job essentially just buying things. They, wastewater treatment plants, a road or a bridge. And so the role of Congress is to put a pot of money in there, and then it gives it to the agency, and the agency then writes checks to basically just let these cities and states and others buy these things. And that made a lot of sense when you're kind of in a system that's not changing or evolving, but we're in a system now where we've got to kind of take this step change to move to a different kind of system in many areas, and this just being one of them. And I think that suggests that we really need to focus on taking some of that money and using it to drive innovation. And I think the fact that the White House has done this is a great thing, but we should be putting 5-10% of all surface transportation money into these kinds of challenge grant programs. Incent people to really do new things. Because once you sort of get there, I mean, the real key to this is really, I think, is testing these things out, making sure things work, getting the standards right, and de-risking things. And once you kind of get there with maybe if you had the top sort of 10% of the users doing this, then it becomes self-sustaining to some extent. But we're not there yet for a lot of this. So I do think that that's a big role for Congress. They did some in the FAST Act, not as much as we proposed in our report called Chips to Concrete, but better than where we were. But I think we could go a lot farther. The next administration, whoever it is, should be having, instead of 70 applicants and 1 winner, why don't we have 200 applicants and 5 winners? Other questions or comments?
Let me just throw in one more thing to what you're saying, Rob. I usually say this only after a glass of red wine, but
Go for it. It's 5 o'clock.
Yeah, earmarks went away, and we have competitions and attempted earmarks through different titles and other things going on. So if we believe that we need to, fertilize innovation at the local and state level, whether it's performance-based earmarks, etc., the more we can move money down and link it to objectives, and clearly innovation is one of them, digitization is another, and a lot of times it's intermodal integration, and we're still in a situation now where I think some of the competitions and these things, all of which are smart and well-intentioned, they tend to advantage larger cities and states, or those that have DC representatives, all that kind of stuff. I think thinking about how do we flatten that out, but link it to some of the, federal government sets the standards of what they want. I do think that's an inevitable demand that's out there, and you just can't do whatever you want with the money. But I just think and the forgiveness forgiveness money that can exist out there, finding flexible, early risk capital that's willing to fail with, it's only the government, so flattering.
I just want to add one, this is going to just kind of throw something in that we haven't talked about, but I think it's really important because you talk about, Rob, the ability to understand technology, to know what it means, to understand new business models and how they operate. One of the initiatives that we're going to be talking about in the next month is the next generation workforce. And that in and of itself is just a huge issue that we could spend a whole other hour and a half on, but I put it on the table because it's so important, because if you look at the next generation, the way they think and the way they want to move and the way in which they talk with one another and the way in which they expect to get around and what their cities and communities are supposed to provide to them, our DOTs are struggling because if you worked for a DOT, you were an engineer, you were a traffic engineer, you kind of worked your way up through as a traffic engineer, and you got a bunch of traffic engineers, all of them are wonderful, wonderful people. But yet now they need people who understand technology. And so the next generation workforce is going to be very, very important. Go look at the new General Electric ad that's out, where the kid comes to the table and tells his father, I'm going to work for GE, and the father puts the hammer on the table and says, good for you, and he goes, no, I'm going to code. And the dad's like, it's okay if you don't know how to use the hammer. That's okay. So it really is this great confluence of the traditional and the non-traditional that I think with this next generation workforce, if we can pull them in, will help push this, because it's the way they think and it's the way they act that will help move this forward. And that isn't really even a government role. That's the role just of all of us pushing them into it and opening up this area for them to be interested in.
So one last just question before we'll close in just a few minutes. We haven't really talked about, sort of touched on a little bit. We've talked largely about sort of local projects, but to do any of these, to do anything on a smart infrastructure, you need 5 things. You need some kind of sensor. You need something to sense what's going on. You need software to kind of manage it. You need transport to send it somewhere. You need cloud storage to host it, and you need analytics. So 5 things. And for a lot of these things, you need to have a local thing. You need to go put a sensor in. You need to. But for some things, like the thing that we really like is Boston Street Bump. Anybody? How many people? A few people. Yeah, well, Boston Street Bump's this cool thing, and you download an app on your phone, your Android or iOS, and when you go over a bump in your car, it sends a signal anonymously. De-identified signal to the Public Works Department saying there's a pothole here. And this has been a big deal because the city now knows potholes, and they actually learned a lot about actually where the bumps are. And I've been pressing Montgomery County to do this because talking about this $3 trillion backlog, I think $1 trillion of it is on my street. Potholes like it's in Calcutta. But the point being, this application exists today. It could be used in every community in America tomorrow. Just like it doesn't require anything other than go into the code and change the geo coordinates in the code, and then have a city. And so this sort of, Dan, I guess.
Bring it on.
Bring it on, Dan. But at one level, you can't expect, and maybe to Dan too, you can't expect cities to do this on their own. Cities can do the innovation, but to scale and build these kind of systems that everybody then can just easily latch into, seems to me that that's a national role, whether it's a federal government role or that new organization you're standing up or a partnership with, Amazon AWS. I don't know what it is, but it just seems to me we need to think more about it. I was talking to an urban planner recently, and he was talking about there's really interesting studies where you could, in some places, you could use electric utility data to find out what they call 24/7 cities. In other words, downtowns. Are downtowns really active and all? But again, you really sort of need a national system like that. Could we have a system where we take electric grid data and really use it for urban planning purposes? Well, maybe New York can do that, but Phoenix isn't doing it. So that's my question. Is this something you think that HUD could do, or somebody, or do we need it, or a partnership area?
Well, so I think it's a great question. First of all, in Montgomery County, are you talking to Dan Hoffman? Chief Innovation Officer. I mean, he's terrific.
I emailed Dan last week. Okay. I told him he should do street bump because I'm tired of my street driving at 2 miles an hour. And Dan's a great guy.
Yeah. So actually, I think that this is something that we've grappled with, and something that is happening, but it's not happening in a systematic way, right? So street bump is just one example, but I think that the common thread here is that these can be replicated at fairly low cost, right? When you talk about the cloud infrastructure required to support it, I mean, the cost is just nominal, right? But the challenge is how do you tailor it to a specific community? And my own view is that I think it's probably it's something that's much more effectively done on the ground, and organizations like Code for America are poised to do it well. Metro Lab Network is talking about doing stuff like this, where it's just taking something that works in one place and doing the small amount of work required to deploy it in another. And Code for America already has organized brigades of volunteer hackers who just care about their local communities. In last I checked, it was 70 different cities around the country. It's probably far more now.
But to be fair, Dan, a lot of Code for America, and I love Code for America,
Yep.
is one-offs. It's, hey, I got this cool idea in this building. And it's still, how do we start sharing code, I guess, is really the question.
Well, I think they're doing that, but I agree that there's a need to continue to do more of it across the landscape. But I think it's something that is not. I don't see that as a core federal role. It seems like something that is that belongs in more of these organizations that are non-governmental organizations that do connect different communities across the country. And part of this is I think it's also just an early stage in some of these programs where it's really people like Dan Hoffman and others coming together and talking and just it happening naturally, to be honest. And so I think there's an opportunity for more networking among those who are trying to do this work, finding ways to self-organize and share ideas.
Can I Dan to this a
Yes.
little? So I think a big piece of this, I'm trying to be optimistic, is talent. So actually, a friend of mine that did a lot of this stuff was the Boston Public Works Director. So talent, people, critical. I do think the federal role is to understand and support as these playbooks, here are the top 10 things you can do get better out of the federal agencies. How do they support intermediaries and the local capacity to anchor these things in government? Because some of the Code for America stuff, unless once you know there's a pothole, the existing public works department still needs to fix it. So I think we're almost there with the Bloomberg Innovative Service Delivery Teams, the Obama administration strong cities, strong community teams, where they sent out smart people, they sat in a mayor's office, they drive real change. Excellent, it works when you have talented people like that in communities that can't afford 7 more smart FTEs. But that's not a scalable model. So the final piece is playbook linked to, maybe there's fewer FTEs in federal agencies waiting by the phone to help work the playbook and have more support out in the field where it's needed more.
One comment?
Yeah.
I just finished as part of a team that finished a project for U.S. Treasury looking at infrastructure projects that have a national economic value. One of the things we found was there weren't that many of them. And almost that there were, most of the projects were being done locally, and that's partly, I think, the way the federal funding is done. That we had to invent several projects or programs because they're not out there. And I think there's some things you do to change the structure of how money is given out that may encourage multi-state, multi-jurisdictional investments.
Great. Well, this has really been wonderful, and first of all, Dan, I want to thank you for everything you're doing in the White House, and this is really great stuff, and looking forward to kind of seeing that.
See you in 10 years.
Can you, by the way, can you tell me who the winner's going to be before? All right, I thought you had an inside track. Okay. Anyway, thank you all for coming, and let's join me in thanking a great panel.
Yeah.